Astonishing Legends Network.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a great summer, and I'm so happy that we're all heading into the fall and the spooky season together. I've got some big announcements, one really big announcement coming up, but first let's talk just about the RHPB live shows, okay? The Light in the Dark Tour. We did our first performance last month in August in Dallas. It was a big success. I got to meet a bunch of you guys, and it worked out really well. I did this show, and then we all hung out afterwards for like an hour and a half, just drinking wine and beer and talking and getting to know each other, which is kind of the whole idea. So now I've got 4 big dates coming up in September. You can get tickets to all of them right now at Eventbrite, and here they are. First, we start things off in Point Pleasant, West Virginia at the 24th Annual Mothman Festival. Susan and I will be at the festival all day on Saturday, September 20th, and we'll have specially designed limited edition branded merch created by our very own Tommy Beaver, who did the RHPB logo. He came up with a really fun picture of me and Mothman hanging out together, and it's going to be on t-shirts and mugs and stickers and specially made tubes of chapstick. So this is stuff you can only get at the festival. So if there's any way you can make it down there, you definitely should. It's going to be crazy. I'll be speaking in the afternoon, and then that night I'll be doing a special live performance of the podcast, the one you can only hear by showing up in person. So definitely make it down to the Mothman Festival in Point Pleasant, West Virginia on Saturday and Sunday, September 20th and 21st. That's the whole festival. We'll be there on the 20th on the Saturday. And I hear it's pretty wild. I've never been there. This will be the first time we've been to the Mothman Festival. And I'll be posing next to the statue so you can get a picture of me rubbing his legendary ass. So there's that. Now, I'm also going to be at a place called Heart Bar in Brooklyn, New York. And that's on Wednesday, September 24th. This place is very cool, and it's probably got the best food and cocktails of any place I'm going to be. And it's right there in Brooklyn, an easy train ride from anywhere in New York. So please join us for that one if you can. And there'll be plenty of RHPB merch for sale there. And then on Saturday night, September 27th, this thing might just be the coolest of all. A listener named Janice got in touch and said, you know what? We do a Halloween haunted house for the whole area every Halloween. And if you'd like, we can get it going a month early and you can do your show at our house. And the audience can get in the mood for the show and Halloween going through the haunted house. How could I say no? That's the coolest thing ever. Now listen, Janice tells me that the haunted house isn't too scary. So you don't have to go through it either. You don't have to. You can just head out to the patio and start drinking. But it's there if you want it. I know I'm going to go through. And I got to tell you, doing a show at one of your houses, I mean, that's amazing. And it's a haunted house. I mean, come on, it's perfect. So that's my dream come true. But wait, there's one more dream come true. And this is the biggest announcement of all. On Monday, September 22nd, I'm doing a show in Washington, D.C. at Kramer's Books, and I will be joined by a special guest. Guests don't get any more special than this. You know him. You love him. You can't live without him. He is the co-host of the podcast that started it all, Astonishing Legends. Yes, it's Scott Philbrook. So Scott and I are going to be there together. We're going to do a live conversation right after my show, and we'll basically be hanging out all night with the fans that show up. So it's going to be so fun. So if you want to see me and the guy who started all of this, Scott Philbrook, together on stage, Washington, D.C. on September 22nd, that's where we're going to be. So a lot of fun stuff coming up. I can't wait. And I really hope you can make it out to one of the live shows. Go to rhpb.eventbrite.com for tickets, or just go to Eventbrite and type in my name. It'll take you to a list of all of our shows. It'll have all the information you need and how you can lock in your tickets. Okay, let's start the show. It's time to meet one of my favorite paranormal authors, Hamlin Garland. He and you and I are about to embark on 40 years of psychic research. Here we go. 40 Years of Psychic Research by Hamlin Garland. The subtitle of Hamlin Garland's 40 Years of Psychic Research, Macmillan Company, New York, 1936, is A Plain Narrative of Fact. The 40 years he refers to are basically 1891 to 1931, which in terms of psychic research are some pretty bitchin' years. So bitchin', in fact, that it makes you wonder why the years since then have seemed to decrease incrementally in their overall bitchinness. Seance room phenomenon was at an all-time high. Slates writing, trumpets flying, ghostly hands feeling you up in the dark. It was a wild time. Mediums were everywhere. And on any given night in a big city like New York, Chicago, or Boston, if you knew the right people, you might find yourself in someone's sitting room, and somewhere between dinner and cigars, you could get all your questions answered about the soul's journey after death. This is what people used to do at night before TikTok. I'm telling you, there was so much paranormal activity, people had ectoplasm coming out of their ears. No, literally. Usually their nose, but sometimes, yeah, their ears. Hamlin Garland was a budding novelist, and just 31 when his friend, a magazine publisher by the name of Benjamin Orange Flower, or B.O. as his friends called him, and by the way, these are all real names, he asked Hamlin to join a group he was forming, a sort of Boston Society for Psychical Research. Flower was assembling a team to carry out investigations, and the plan was to publish their results in a monthly journal. Hamlin tells B.O. that he doesn't really know anything about spiritualism, and in any case, he is devoted to the, quote, positive sciences. In today's parlance, he's a skeptic. Flower says, quote, "That's just why we want you. You are young, logical in your thought, and a close observer. Furthermore, you are not bereaved as so many people are who go into this work. You're not a mourner. You can approach an experiment with an unprejudiced mind. I am also asking Professor Amos Emerson Dolbear of Tufts College to serve with us. He's a physicist and an inventor. He and you will offset Mino J. Savage and Ernest Allen, who are already committed to the spirit side of the question, as am I. Rabbi Solomon Schindler, who is inclined to the negative side, has also consented to act, and we shall have, I hope, one or two other men of science." I love how Flower is so upfront about his own credulity, and how he's counting on others to balance it out. So Hamlin agrees to join, but only if Professor Dolbear does too. And his only other stipulation is that his mornings are not disturbed, for this is when Hamlin Garland wrote, and he did all of his writing from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. After that, his time was his own. And how this bastard got all his work done in 3 hours from 6 to 9, I'll never know. The lifestyle described in this book is what I find so charming and so attractive. A typical day for Hamlin Garland involves writing from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., then taking a train somewhere, meeting up with his buds, having luncheon — it's never lunch, always luncheon — at some smoky old club, and then delivering a lecture about art or poetry or politics or ghosts to a room full of well-dressed people, followed by dinner at some chandelier-lit hotel dining room, and then off to a seance. To be honest, this is the life I aspire to. Now, I don't know exactly what's changed in the world of after-death communication in the last 100 years, but I'll tell you one thing. It's gotten a lot less theatrical and a lot less pervy. Pervy, you say? Tell me more, Richard. Okay, here's the thing. Back in the day, seances were almost always conducted in total darkness, and the medium, almost always a woman, had to be thoroughly restrained so she couldn't fake it. So, a bunch of dudes with beards would spend hours tying mediums' wrists and ankles with dental floss, which is harder to escape from than rope and also really hurts. Or maybe they'd nail their dress sleeves to the arms of their chair, or they'd blindfold the medium and use ropes to attach the chair to the floor and to the walls. I swear to God, they've got so many different ways to tie women up in seance rooms, it's almost like its own category on Pornhub. Anyway, they turn out the lights, and at some point the medium passes out, and everyone takes off their shoes and puts their feet on each other, and they keep asking where everyone else's hands are, and who just touched me? Did someone just touch you? I felt something. There's just something so incredibly kinky about it all. So we've lost that. Nowadays, you're meeting a medium in a condo in North Hollywood at 2 p.m, and there's a stack of crystals and some patchouli oil, and no one's getting tied up or felt up, and you're lucky if your grandma shows up and says she still loves you. But enough of my complaining. Let me be clear. I feel quite sure Hamlin Garland was actually a really decent guy. And while he certainly did his share of tying women up, it was always in the name of science. Now you might ask, where did Hamlin Garland fall on the scale of debunkerism? Like if you put Harry Houdini on one end and the most credulous, grief-stricken spiritualist on the other. Well, Garland was all the way over next to Harry Houdini, except for one crucial difference. Hamlin Garland had no agenda and no axe to grind. You see, Houdini's genius for self-promotion knew no bounds. He was an international celebrity back when those did not exist. He may have been the first. He made news wherever he went, and of course, it was all predicated on him being, quote, the world's best at whatever it was he was attempting, an illusion, an escape of some kind, whatever. Houdini did not become world famous for being able to escape some handcuffs, or even most handcuffs. He became world famous for escaping all handcuffs. "No lock can hold him" was an early slogan, soon followed by "no prison cell can hold him." But there was one thing Houdini could never quite escape: the confines of his own celebrity. Once his reputation as a debunker of mediums took hold, he quite rightly realized that he had a new claim to fame and only one path available to him. He had to conclude, loudly and publicly, that every single medium he ever tested was a fraud. And it was at this point that any flickering interest he may have had about the reality of spiritualism or the possibility of connecting with his mother from beyond the grave evaporated completely. Now, because he was a magician, it was as a magician that he exposed mediums. He would assert they were using versions of the same tricks he did on stage, and then he would reveal exactly how they were doing it. The narrative that Houdini created was that when he stepped into the seance room, it was magician against magician, whether it was or not. And against a magician, Houdini could never lose. Once again, it simply wouldn't do for him to debunk most of the mediums he tested if he let even one slip by without declaring them to be a total fraud, whether he personally caught them frauding or not. It would be the equivalent of publicly admitting that he had been fooled by a rival magician. And since he was the greatest magician in the world, well, it all goes around and around and around. Hamlin Garland had no such handicaps or restrictions. His only reputation was that of a well-respected, award-winning novelist. Testing mediums was nothing more than a hobby, albeit one that he took very seriously. He wasn't a zealot, and he had no cause. Add to this that he was most definitely not a spiritualist, and was in fact a devoted materialist, and what we're left with is the ideal investigator of the unknown, one who is intellectually and philosophically open-minded enough to allow for an outcome he is not committed to in advance. So, what were his conclusions at the end of his 40 years of psychic research? Well, 1, actual seance phenomenon does exist. It is not rare, nor even particularly hard to come by. And 2, after 40 years, he still could not definitively link the phenomena he witnessed in the seance room with absolute proof of life after death. One thing you'll notice early on in this book is that Hamlin Garland had absolutely no sense of the uncanny. Nothing that happened in the seance room creeped him out, not even a little. Look, personally, if I ever saw books fly off a shelf or a pencil leap up and begin writing on its own, I'd lose my fucking mind. But for Hamlin Garland, this was just a demonstration of an as yet unknown physical force. He felt that his first job was to make absolutely certain that the medium was not somehow faking these effects. That part of his process, the part that Houdini so loudly celebrated himself for, was actually fairly easy to achieve, and we'll talk about that in a second. But anyway, once that was sorted, it became a simple matter of his remaining alert and then testing the actual phenomenon, or spirits if you will, to see if they would follow his instructions that he was making up on the spot. In Garland's own words, quote, "So far as I am able, I shall present the evidence in a spirit of fairness, and especially do I wish to promulgate the philosophy which acknowledges nothing is supernatural. Facts are known or unknown. They can't be above or beyond nature. They may be unusual and new to our senses, but if a ghost really walks, why be alarmed about it? If an astral hand touches you, why shrink and cry out? It's a natural phenomenon, startling only because it is new and not understood." This makes sense to me. I feel safe with Hamlin Garland as my guide through these otherwise foggy and shadow-covered realms. 80 years after these words were spoken, in January of 1988, I found myself wandering the campus of USC past buildings I had never seen before. Where was I? The engineering school? The law area? The dentistry quad? Who knew? I'd been here for 4 years, and yet I was still a complete stranger. It was the first day of my final semester, and things were not the way they were supposed to be. A new semester used to feel exciting. New classes, new books, new beginnings. But now, I just felt stupid and lost and out of place. That's how you're supposed to feel as a freshman, not a senior. The class I was looking for began in 10 minutes. It was in one of the 4 buildings surrounding me, but I had no idea which one. Now, I should be panicking right now, and that panic should be blasting a wave of adrenaline through my body. And I should be running from one building to the other, desperately trying to locate my class so I wouldn't arrive late. Instead, I sat down on a cold stone bench. Panic I was used to. Panic I liked. It came with energy and forward movement. Panic had fueled me my entire life. It was familiar. It was my friend. But this thing that I was feeling now, what the fuck was this? I really didn't know. I felt like a runner in the final mile of a marathon who for some reason just slows to a walk and then finally wanders off the track completely. Is this what it feels like to give up? I wasn't sure because I'd never done it. So why was I doing it now? 5 years ago, I had made a plan. It was simple: become a TV writer and marry Michelle Goodwin. The plan didn't seem crazy. At the time, I had already written a TV script and I was dating Michelle. The deadline for this plan was May of 1988, just 5 months from right now. That's when I'd be graduating college. And the one advantage of getting things figured out so early was that I wouldn't have to be one of those pathetic assholes sitting around after college, working some stupid job, and suddenly trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I already knew, and I'd already be doing it. I was way ahead of the game. I was smarter than everyone, and I was going to beat everyone. I was going to win. but the scripts I'd written hadn't sold. And the girlfriend I'd waited for 4 years was finally back from Yale and living in Pasadena and dating someone else. After working every day and night for 5 years, I had failed at the two most important things in my life. I felt hopeless. I felt stupid for failing. And for the first time, I felt stupid for having even tried. I noticed a small group of kids heading inside the oldest of the 4 buildings. Maybe those people knew where they were going. I got up and followed. I pushed open a sticky wooden door and breathed in the scent of chalk dust and floor wax. The kids ahead of me were walking into a room at the end of the hall, room 100. I followed them inside and found myself standing in the very last row of seats in a kind of an amphitheater that terraced steeply down to a desk on a raised dais surrounded by 3 old-fashioned green chalkboards. The room was packed, and the other students looked just as sad and lost as me, except they also looked a lot younger. A South Asian graduate student entered and addressed us all with an outpouring of enthusiasm that made my stomach tighten. Hello, welcome, greetings everyone. I hope you are all here for Freshman Algebra 101 because that is what I am going to teach you. Guys, I had taken advanced classes in film theory, art history, and even a graduate-level course on the works of James Joyce, and I'd aced them all. But I had recently received a letter from USC informing me that I would not receive my diploma in May because I had not completed the most basic lower-level math requirement. Did I know I was supposed to take freshman algebra 4 years ago? Yes. Had I put it off on purpose, thinking that somehow I would sell a script, drop out of school, and never have to actually do it? Yes. And now here I was. Final semester. I was still in school, just like everyone else. I wasn't beating anyone. I wasn't winning. And now it looked like I might not even graduate at all. Of course, all I had to do was take this class and pass. How hard could that be? Oh, my sweet summer child, how hard indeed. Later that week, I was at my parents' house playing poker with my friends Tim and Herb and Larry. It was Friday night. This had been our habit for the past month. Friday night used to be my date night with Michelle, but tonight it wasn't because, just before Christmas, we had basically broken up. After 4 long years at Yale, Michelle had finally moved back to LA. She immediately moved out of her mom's house and was into a small apartment in Alhambra. It was exciting to visit her in her own place, but I wasn't allowed to spend the night with her because I was still living at home. And it became very clear very quickly that she was ambivalent about being back in Los Angeles. All the friends she had made at school were all still living back east. The pressure of paying back her student loans started immediately, and her stress level rose accordingly. So she applied for an emergency teaching credential, and by September was heading up a 3rd grade class at a school in Atwater Village, about a mile from Dodger Stadium. The thing about teaching 3rd grade? It's hard as fuck, and it wasn't her dream. So neither one of us was doing what we wanted to do, and even though we were basically happy to be together, neither one of us was really happy. And that was a problem, because my self-appointed task in life was to make sure she was happy, and she wasn't, and there didn't seem to be anything I could do about it. We met up at her place one night in mid-December. She was a little drunk from the school faculty Christmas party, and I was excited because I thought it would lead to some very grown-up feeling sex at her apartment. But I could tell right away that something was off. I asked her what was wrong, and she surprised me by immediately telling me that she thought we should start seeing other people. And that specifically, she would be seeing a teacher at her school named Hatem, who she had been talking to a lot for the past couple of months. She explained that she loved me and didn't exactly want to break up. But so much had changed in her life over the past year. Coming back to Los Angeles and resuming her relationship with me hadn't made her happy in the way she thought it would. And she didn't think it was a good idea to commit herself to me until she was absolutely sure that this was the relationship she wanted. And the only way for her to be absolutely sure was to explore other options, like Hatem Aguilar, who had incidentally told her the other night that it was weird to him that she was still dating her high school boyfriend, and how could she at age 21 possibly commit to a permanent relationship with me when she'd never even dated a 30-year-old man like him. And it was Hatem who noticed how unhappy she seemed and helped her identify this conflict within herself that she hadn't been completely aware of until he had pointed it out. So now she just felt like she owed it to herself to explore this thing, whatever it was. And she said that maybe we both needed to at least consider the possibility that Hatem knew something about us and relationships in general that we didn't. 'Cause, he was 30. What was I supposed to say? She was clearly going to sleep with this guy. That's what she was telling me. She wasn't exactly asking permission. It was more like she was avoiding technically cheating on me by telling me in advance that she was going to do it, and arguing about it would just be immature. So we didn't. I just left in a fog of humiliation, still unclear if we were dating or not, or in love or not, or what I was even supposed to do. I sat in my car trying to get angry, but I was too confused and scared. So I went back to her apartment where she was already on the phone with Hatem. She calmly told him that I was back, and they hung up. Then I asked her if we were broken up, and she said no. She still wanted to see me. She just wanted to see Hatem too. Then some weird, aggressive, possessive feeling came over me, and I started making out with her, and we ended up having some of the most intense sex we've ever had. But when I finally left her place the second time that night, now at almost 3 a.m, I felt colder and more alone than I ever had in my life. That was a month ago, and I hadn't seen her since. Hamlin Garland's investigations into the dark world of psychic phenomenon started immediately. A lot of his early cases involved mediums who did something called slate writing. Now let me explain what this is. School children in those days did their lessons on slates. So picture a small 8x10-inch chalkboard set into a wooden frame. Now picture 2 of them joined at a hinge so that it could open and close like a book. Got it? Okay. The only other thing you need to know about these slates is that you didn't use chalk to write on them, you used a slate pencil. And instead of lead, these pencils often contained soapstone, which made for neater, dust-free writing. And you would transport all this by closing the pencil inside the 2 slates and then putting a strap around them and la-di-da. That's really all you need to know about slates to understand what's about to happen. While on a visit to Indianapolis on other business, Garland heard about a local woman who was a medium specializing in slate writing. So he went to see her immediately with no appointment or introduction. It was 2 p.m, right after luncheon. They go into her sitting room and take up positions on either side of a small wooden table. From the book, quote, "The little room was flooded with direct afternoon sunlight. I had brought with me a pair of folding school slates. The medium put a tiny piece of pencil between the slates, closed them, and thrust them under the table." Okay, so Garland and this woman are now facing each other across a small table, and each one of them is holding one end of the closed slates with their right hand. Garland immediately hears the click and scratch of the slate pencil moving around between the 2 slates. As soon as the sound stops, the medium brings the slates up from under the table and opens them, revealing several messages, all addressed to a guy named Henry Wallace, who just happens to be the man who recommended this medium to Garland earlier that day, but was unknown to her. Okay. Garland's thinking the same thing I'm thinking and you're thinking. That guy got in touch with her, she wrote some stuff, switched the slates, I don't know, something along those lines. Well, Garland decides to cut to the chase. He tells her to put the slates down on the tabletop and lean back in her chair. So she does, and they both lean back, neither one of them touching the slates or the table. And again, the scratching and clicking sounds begin. From the book. The medium's hands were in her lap, fully 2 feet from the table's edge and in clear daylight. Upon opening the slates, I again found them filled with writing. If the doubter says, "You were deceived. Nothing is so deceptive as our senses," I would reply, "Very true, but they're all we have. I controlled the conditions. I dictated all the methods. What more could I ask?" You may be wondering what the writing was, what messages the spirits were trying to put across. Well, as it turns out, it was a lot of junk. Non sequitur sentences and signatures of unknown people. But something had animated the small piece of slate pencil to write words on closed slates, and it was neither of the 2 living human beings in the house. For you and me, this would be the most incredible thing to have ever happened in our lives. For Hamlin Garland, it was just another Wednesday afternoon. He must have met with and tested over a dozen mediums who were capable of doing everything this woman could do and more. His witnessing of this sort of phenomenon was so common, in fact, that he reports in this case that he left that afternoon fascinated but nonplussed, and that he has since forgotten the woman's name and in any case never saw her again. But that's impossible, you say. If it was so common, how could it be that men of science continued to denigrate the practice of mediumship and refuse to take it seriously? Well, Hamlin Garland felt the same way. So a few years later, he invited his colleague, the physicist and professor at Tufts College I mentioned earlier, Amos Dolbear, to help him investigate a particularly stunning medium he had had some success with, a woman named Mrs. Smiley. Maybe with the esteemed physicist at his side, Garland would catch the medium faking or finally prove that something undeniable was happening. It was now mid-February, and I was meeting with Arjun Chakrabarti because I had failed the first 2 weekly algebra check-ins. They weren't called tests, they were called check-ins. We'd learn a new algebra concept each week in class, Monday through Thursday from 8 to 8:50 in the morning. Then every Friday, you'd go to the algebra lab and sit at a computer and do that week's 10-question algebra check-in. You had to get 7 right, and you only got 1 shot. "Ah, Richard," he said, beaming as he opened the door to his small office. A depressed-looking girl preceded him out the door. She wandered off down the hall. "Come in," he said. I was clearly one of a dozen or so students he was meeting with during his office hours, all who had failed their first 2 check-ins. "Do not get mad and sad and bad," he said. Mad and sad and bad was a phrase he used a lot, always with a smile on his face. Arjun Chakrabarti sincerely believed that everyone had the innate ability to do algebra. But it was his responsibility to meet with students who failed more than 1 check-in to see if they needed special help. "Is there something I can do to make my concepts more clear?" he asked. The answer, of course, was no. The problem wasn't his teaching. It was my lack of learning. How could this be happening? And even worse, why was I unable to give a shit? With Michelle dating Adam Aguilar, or more to the point, having sex with Adam Aguilar, everything in my life felt blunted and unreal. My writing had ground to a halt. Every time I tried to motivate myself in any direction, an image would appear in my mind of them in bed together, and I would feel the life drain out of me. "Hey, Rich," you may ask, "why didn't you just break up with her? Put yourself out of your misery, move on with your life." These are all excellent questions. All I can tell you is that I couldn't. The whole situation left me feeling weak and dizzy and sick with humiliation. And immobile. It was like I was watching myself slowly falling off a cliff, just watching the body fall. I should be doing something about it, but I couldn't, or wouldn't. Maybe part of me was curious what would happen if for the first time in my life, I let myself hit the ground. As this image played across my interior vision, I realized that Mr. Chakrabarti was still talking to me and I hadn't heard a word he'd said. I'm sorry, what was that? He repeated himself, louder and with greater enunciation. You will have a chance to retake your check-ins. This time I heard him. This was news to me. He explained that I could do a remedial Monday check-in, sort of a consolation round, but on these I could only get one answer wrong. You should try to make up at least one of the check-ins, he said. If you do not successfully complete 3 check-ins, you will have to retake the whole course in the fall. He was, of course, assuming I was a freshman. He didn't know that for me, fall was not an option. Everything Mr. Chakrabarti said was carefully phrased to avoid a particular word. That word was failure. I suddenly understood that for Mr. Chakrabarti, I was just one student in one session of freshman algebra. He clearly spent all his office hours with dozens of non-succeeding students, just like me, desperately trying to keep them positive and motivated, trying to keep them from feeling mad and sad and bad. But I did. I felt mad and sad and bad. Why was his relentless positivity, a quality I used to consider one of my own, making me feel worse and worse? 2 minutes later, as he called in his next student, I walked out of his office more depressed than ever. And somewhere in the back of my mind, the body kept falling. It was now another Friday night poker game with Tim and Herb and Larry. We were playing for real money, and you could win or lose up to $20 a night, which even then didn't mean much. There was something comforting, even soothing, about the rote rhythm of the shuffling, the dealing, the play, the betting, the shit talk. It required so little of me, which was perfect, because I had so little to give. For the first time in years, I had no plan, no scheme, nothing in the works, and nothing to look forward to. It didn't feel bad exactly. It just didn't feel like much of anything. After a while, we took a break. Herb got up to refill his wine glass from the box of Chablis that my mom kept on the kitchen counter. Larry opened another Coke. Tim leaned back, took us all in, and in one big sweeping gaze said, "Okay, I've been sneaking out and doing something for the last couple of months, and I haven't told anyone about it." Larry said, "You're gay." Herb said, "You're murdering drifters." I didn't say anything. I had such a deep and pathological fear of secrets that I couldn't say anything at all until he revealed what it was, and I was sure I was safe. With a sense of real drama, Tim finally announced, "I've been doing stand-up." "What?" I said, way louder than I meant to. Satisfied that he'd blown at least one person away with this big news, he told his story. A couple of months earlier, our friend Alan Feynman had dragged him to an open mic night at a place called the LA Comedy Cabaret in Encino. Tim sat through 2 hours of what he called laugh-free comedy. Everybody was terrible, except Alan. But it got him thinking. So he went home and wrote a 5-minute routine. Then he went to the very same open mic night the following week and killed. He'd been doing it once or twice a week at various places all over Southern California ever since. "It's way easier than it looks," he said. "The audience wants to laugh. The problem with 90% of the comics is that they literally have no act. They just get on stage and ramble and hope a joke comes out." According to Tim, the entire trick was to actually prepare. Write out, memorize, and rehearse a 5-minute act. If you can project confidence, he said, and get the words out and say something that even sounds remotely like a joke, the audience will laugh. I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. It was like the answer to a complicated math problem the world hadn't been able to figure out, but in just a matter of days, Tim had solved it. Color flooded the room, and everything took on sharp edges. I felt something squirming around in my stomach. I had dreamed of doing stand-up since I was about 5, but I never had. And now here was Tim saying he'd been doing it secretly for 2 months, and it was easy. No one says stand-up comedy is easy. Nobody but Tim Doyle. All of you need to do this, he said. You guys are 10 times funnier than anyone I've seen at these open mic nights. I'm telling you, you'll kill. Something was waking up inside of me. Something I'd missed. It was fear. And as it always did for me, it came factory loaded with a sensation of forward momentum. How do you think up the jokes? I said, and I knew it was a stupid question, but I didn't care. Tim instantly assured me, it's simple. All we ever do when we hang out is make fun of everything we see. Seriously, just think back over the last few weeks and write down the funniest things you said. It made a kind of sense. I mean, I didn't know about Larry or Herb, but I had a solid memory of everything I had ever said that had gotten a laugh going all the way back to kindergarten. The rest of the night felt vivid and real. I felt inside the world for the first time in weeks. Suddenly, I was starving. We ordered 3 pizzas from Shakey's instead of our usual 2, and I ate the 3rd one myself. It was after 2 a.m. when everyone finally left, but it didn't matter. I was wide awake. I went into my room, pulled out a pen and a notebook, and got to work. Hamlin Garland got to work too, except his work involved wrapping up the psychic medium, Mrs. Smiley, in adhesive tape. Her legs were fastened to the chair with tape, and the ends of the tape were nailed to the floor. The chair itself was wrapped in tape, and the ends of that tape were nailed to the bookshelf behind Mrs. Smiley. And her wrists were tied to the wooden armrests of her chair with dental floss. It was November 10th, 1893. Hamlin Garland and Mrs. Smiley were joined tonight by Garland's skeptical physicist friend, Amos Dolbear, and Dolbear's wife. She doesn't get a name in the book. She's just Dolbear's wife. And for added fraud-proofing, tonight's seance was taking place inside Dolbear's home, where Mrs. Smiley had never been before. Dolbear sees that Smiley is totally restrained and that her chair can't move. But he has one more trick up his sleeve. He drapes pages of newsprint over Mrs. Smiley's lap and tacks them to the floor. This way, he says, if she even tries to move, they'll hear the paper crinkling in the dark. Okay, so the seance begins. And in the next 2 hours, here's what happened. The table they were seated around moved both away and back toward Mrs. Smiley at a distance of over 3 feet in both directions. Over 20 books flew from the bookshelf and stacked themselves into neat piles on the table. At the random request of Mrs. Dolbear, a candy box filled with candy traveled across the room and landed gently in front of her. A 3-foot tin cone, like a megaphone, levitated and moved around the room at Garland's request, and 5 separate and distinct voices emanated from it and answered questions posed on the spot by Dolbear and Garland, and answered them all correctly. When the seance was concluded and the lights were turned on, it was clear that Mrs. Smiley had not moved. The newspaper was still draped over her lap and remained tacked to the floor without a single tear. None of the pieces of tape had been disturbed, and the silk threads at her wrists were still firmly tied, so much so that the flesh around them was raised and red. Afterwards, Garland and Dolbear tried to process what had just happened. Garland had the advantage. He'd seen this sort of thing before, but Dolbear was completely dumbstruck. For him, what had happened tonight inside his own home was impossible. From the book. If she could have freed her hands, Dolbear said, she could have reached the books. But she didn't, I said. She could not possibly have gotten out of those loops of silk thread, and if she had done so, she could not have gotten back into them. And what about the voices? Why didn't the newspaper crackle when the table was being shaken? What more can you demand? You prepared this room before she had so much as crossed its threshold. Barring the darkness, you and I had things all our own way, and yet the woman met our tests. Dolbear sat like a man who has been dealt a stunning blow. It's all preposterous, he said. Impossible. There must be some natural way of explaining it. There is no place for the supernatural in my world. What about the supernormal, I cried. The possibilities of unknown biodynamic forces are infinite. Dolbear shot back. If she will permit me to hold her hands while the cone moves, I will surrender. Oh, no, you won't, I laughed. You think you will, but you won't. Your doubts are not due to any defect in any actual experiment, but to the inexorable strength of prepossession which holds you back from acceptance of the phenomenon we have witnessed. I confess, I took malicious delight in cataloging these facts. Later that night, while walking to the streetcar, Garland reflects on what has just happened, and what will likely happen tomorrow. From the book, quote, Dolbear is shaken, I thought, astounded, almost convinced. But as he meets his fellow instructors on campus tomorrow, he will not mention any of these baffling phenomena. Or if he does, he will jest about them. They will have taken on the fantastic character of a dream. Garland, of course, was correct. The following Friday night in my parents' living room, I performed my act for Herb, Larry, Tim, and Tim's girlfriend, Gina. I was incredibly nervous. I was used to making these people laugh, but now the whole thing felt awkward, self-conscious, and false. I respected these people and their opinions on comedy more than anyone in the world. Bombing in front of them for me would have been worse than bombing on The Tonight Show. Luckily, that didn't happen. Tim helped me tweak some lines, but beyond that, they all said I was good to go. Larry surprised us by doing his routine right after me, and it was fucking hysterical. He hadn't even told us he was working on one. Herb made it clear that he had no interest in being a professional comedian, and we all assured him that this was a wise decision. Now that Larry and I were basically ready, Tim dropped the bomb. Dave McNary is holding auditions at the Ice House tomorrow. You're going. Apparently, this McNary guy was responsible for putting together main stage shows on Sunday nights. It wasn't exactly open mic, it was a showcase for 8 comics, and you had to audition to get in. Tim was already in, but there were a few more spots to fill. Larry and I agreed immediately. That night, lying in bed, I started to feel like myself again. I had a plan. I had something I wanted, and it wasn't going to be easy. But that's what made it worth doing. For the first time in 2 months, I had a stake in my future. The next day, at 2 p.m, I was actually on stage at a comedy club. Sure, there was no audience, just Dave McNary, plus Larry and Tim hanging out. But there I was, in front of a brick wall, like a million other comics I'd seen all my life. I felt strangely relaxed and at home. Even more than when I was writing, I felt like I was standing in the center of my life. I was where I wanted to be. I did my routine. Dave McNary laughed a lot. Tim and Larry started out laughing a lot too, probably to get Dave going, but after a minute or so, they must have recognized it wasn't necessary, so they backed off. And when I finally walked off stage, it was as if I walked into my own future. A future I never could have guessed at even 2 weeks earlier. A little later, Dave came into the bar where we were waiting and told Larry that he loved his act and he was in the showcase. Then he told me that he loved my stage presence, but felt the material could be stronger. He didn't feel I was ready yet, but if I wanted to, I could come back and audition again in 2 months. Then he walked out. Because of course I didn't make it. Why should this be any different than any other part of my life? I put all of myself into my TV scripts, and they hadn't sold. I put all of myself into my relationship with Michelle, but now she was off with some other guy. I couldn't even pass my algebra check-ins. And now this. Any way you measured it, I didn't measure up. I had lived my whole life convincing myself that I was something special. And I did that to mitigate the horrible fear that not only wasn't I something special, I wasn't anything at all. But sooner or later, life informs you of reality. And it had been informing me for quite some time. I just hadn't been listening. Instead of lying to myself and pretending that I was special, I was going to begin the process of forcing myself to accept that I wasn't special. I figured once I truly accepted that, I could reapproach my life in a way where I wouldn't get punched in the face so often. I would aim lower and maybe do better. I stepped outside into a gray and soundless world, empty of everything, including fear. Throughout the years of his psychic research, for Hamlin Garland, life goes on. He publishes a novel every year, he gets married, he has children, and he continues attending seances. Why? He's not a spiritualist, so he's not trying to prove the legitimacy of a religion. He's not a debunker, so he isn't trying to snuff out the very practice of mediumship. After all these years, what is he still looking for? He'd already witnessed enough seance room phenomenon to convince himself it was a real, physical, as he would put it, biodynamic force. What was left? An incident, not even halfway through his 40 years, seemed to answer that question for him. It is 1908, and he is once again in Indianapolis attending a slate writing seance with a psychic by the name of Mrs. Hartley. By the way, you know these mediums' names are all fake, right? I mean, don't go to Indianapolis and try to find Mrs. Hartley. Even if it was her real name and you tracked her down, she'd be like 168 years old. So at one point, Mrs. Hartley asks Hamlin Garland to focus on someone he would like to communicate with on the other side. And Garland suddenly thinks of his friend, composer Edward Alexander McDowell, who had recently died after a long decline. The slates are closed and held beneath the table, same as always. And when they are brought back up and revealed, Garland sees these words, quote, "I would that you could see me as I am now, still occupied and happy to be busy. E. A. McDowell." You or I would be blown away, but Garland was barely moved. Maybe Mrs. Hartley somehow knew that he and McDowell were friends. And so maybe through some force of her own, she was able to manifest these words onto the slate. However, if it was McDowell, Garland next asks that McDowell jot down a bar from his tragic sonata. It appears now that Garland, for the first time, is doing two things at once. He's testing the medium as he usually does, but he is also curious, personally invested, you might say, about whether he is truly communicating with his friend. The slates once again go beneath the table. When the slates are revealed, a bar of music is written there. Now, Garland had no idea if this bar of music was part of the tragic sonata or not. And then an even more astounding thing began to happen. Whispers emanated near the center of the table, apparently from McDowell to Garland, instructing him on what notes to add or change to what had been written on the slates. Garland, knowing nothing about music, but everything about a willing ghost when he heard one, asked McDowell to participate in an experiment. He asked him to dictate an unpublished work of his during their next seance. Maybe after all these years, Garland would finally prove more than just the reality of seance phenomenon. Maybe this time he would prove the literal survival of the human soul beyond death. By the middle of March, I only had two goals: pass algebra and not talk to Michelle. She'd called me a few times and left messages saying she missed me, and she understood if I didn't want to see her, but she would really like to see me. But at the same time, I knew she hadn't broken up with Hatem. So hoping that in some way I was hurting her even a little bit as much as she was hurting me, I didn't call her back. I tried to imagine her checking her phone answering machine and being gutted by the absence of any message from me. But my mind would drift, and instead I would picture her having sex with Hatem, and I would literally punch my own face with balled-up fists to drive the image out of my mind. And then I would get back to my real work, the work that would define me as a person for the rest of my life, my algebra homework. Why had I thought I was better than this? Here's the news. I studied the lessons every night for hours, and then guess what? I got good at algebra. I passed the weekly check-ins. No inborn talent, no passion, no magic, nothing special. Just focus on a mundane task and then hopefully achieve it. Adjust your goals. Lower the bar. Take the win. A small W, not a big one. But either way, it felt good. That Friday night, Tim had a favor to ask. He'd been trying to get stage time on the Sunday open mic night at the Improv on Melrose, but so far he hadn't had any luck. The Improv was kind of the holy grail of open mics. Comics, good experienced comics, would jockey to get a spot. But it worked on a lottery system. You showed up at 4:30 in the afternoon and put your name on a list. By 6:30, there'd be over 100 names. They would draw 10 at random, and those 10 people would get to do a 5-minute set. Tim's plan was simple. He wanted Larry and I to go with him and sign up. But if they called me or Larry, he'd go up in our place under our name. It tripled his chances at getting stage time, 3 lottery tickets instead of just 1, which was fine with us. Larry didn't feel like he was ready for the Improv, and I had withdrawn completely from the notion of ever doing stand-up again. It obviously was not my thing. That Sunday, we all drove down to the Improv. We signed up at 4:30, and then went to Cantor's Deli for sandwiches, and then drove back just before 6:30. They started to announce the names, and by number 8, all 3 of us had been called. Suffice to say, we had not seen this coming. Larry hadn't planned to go up, but once his name got called, he decided, what the hell? Tim was obviously going up, and both of them assumed I was going up too because I hadn't told them that I was rearranging my entire life with a new bar set much lower and that it no longer included jumping into any and all available spotlights. It put me in an awkward position because if I were truly committed to this new life of mundanity and mediocrity, I had no other choice but to explain why I wasn't going on stage with them. So I explained. And like the great friends that they were, they told me that they didn't care, I could do whatever I wanted, and then they both walked away from me to sign in with the door manager and secure their spots. I watched Tim and Larry sign up, and then wander off into the parking lot to rehearse their acts. Michelle was out with Hatem that night. Whenever they were out together, my life diminished in size, like I was watching it through the wrong end of a telescope. I stood on the sidewalk in front of maybe the most famous comedy club in Los Angeles, feeling stupid and small and very out of place. I had never felt like this before, like my life didn't matter, like I wasn't at the center of my own life. Maybe it was more realistic to live in a world of lowered expectations where I expected nothing of myself or the world. Maybe this was smart, realistic, and healthy. But I realized, in that moment, it just wasn't me. For me to be me, to feel like me, I had to be aiming at something, grabbing at something that I couldn't easily reach. Had to at least be fucking trying. And that dropping body I kept seeing, the one that was always falling and falling and falling in a continuous loop in the back of my mind, well, I was kidding myself. Because that body had hit the ground 2 months ago, the night in December when Michelle left me, when every hope I had for that relationship died. Who was I kidding? I wasn't not feeling pain. I was feeling plenty. I was back into my cycle of self-punishment. The only difference was now I wasn't offering myself a way out. It was all stick, no carrot. I realized that I was a complete failure at being a failure. I wanted to succeed. So, once again, I righted the scales. I counterbalanced desolation and abandonment with furious motion, with grandiose desire, and the pursuit of an impossible goal to prove to me that I was going to survive. But to do this, I had to allow panic and fear and anxiety back into my heart to fuel me. So I did, and I was so happy to see them. They were my friends from childhood, the only ones that had never really abandoned me, the only things I could always count on. I was getting the band back together, and I was going to need them because I was going on stage tonight. I wasn't even sure exactly why. This whole stand-up thing was so new. But what wasn't new was the absolute overwhelming desire to succeed at something difficult. So that's what I was going to try to do. With nothing on the line and no hope for the future, maybe it didn't matter what I did. If I did great, it wouldn't change anything. And if I bombed, it also wouldn't change anything. I went up to the door manager and claimed my spot. Then I joined the other 9 guys in the parking lot, all of them staked out in separate areas, walking in circles and mouthing their routines to themselves. I methodically went through every single word of my act, still memorized and carved into my soul, the very same act that Dave McNary had casually told me was simply not good enough. I only had time to go through it once. It was going to have to be good enough. Tonight, for the first time in my life, I was going to do stand-up comedy. At 6:55, they brought us inside. There was no green room, no backstage. The comics all sat in the main showroom at tables toward the front, right up by the stage. The idea was we'd just get up when the MC called our name, walk up on stage, do our act, then walk back down into the audience and sit back down. When the show started, it was just the 10 of us in the huge room, plus a handful of our friends and guests, all clustered up at the front. The first couple of guys performed to a mostly empty room. But after a while, people started trickling in with their drinks, getting ready for the main show that would start at 8, when the open mic night ended. We would go on in the order that we'd checked in. Tim was 6, Larry was 7, I was last. By the time Tim went up, the room was half filled, and the audience was in a good mood. Tim legitimately killed. It was the first time Larry or I had actually seen him do his act, and it was absolutely galvanizing to see someone I had known only as a friend standing on stage making strangers laugh. Larry went up next and did even better than Tim. Things were falling into place. I thought to myself, all you have to do is what Tim said. Act confident and get the words out. Larry and Tim thought I was funny. The audience thought they were funny. Therefore, Due to the transitive property of stand-up comedy, the audience would also think I was funny. It was simple algebra. I have no clear memory of how comic number 9 did. All I knew was that nothing else in the world mattered to me more than doing well tonight. Suddenly, the MC was introducing me. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've saved the best for last. This guy has been playing all over town, the Comedy Store, the Hermosa Beach Comedy and Magic Club. He's got dates coming up in Vegas. He's a rising star. You're gonna love him. He's the funniest man in the world. Here he is, Richard Hatem. This was all bullshit, of course, and obviously a gag he did at the end of every open mic night. He was either setting me up to succeed or setting me up to fail, but it didn't matter. The room was full now, and the audience was applauding as I stood up from my table and climbed up the stairs at the side of the stage and then turned around to face them. And I was home. The spotlight was so bright in my eyes I could only barely make out the people in the front row. Everyone else was a dark, shadowy mass beyond the bright circle of light in my eyes. I couldn't see them. I couldn't make eye contact. This was something I hadn't anticipated. I could feel panic swelling, rising up inside of me like an ocean wave. And I rode it like a tiny surfer perched on a tsunami. I was where I wanted to be. Terrified. Finally. Hamlin Garland wasn't terrified. He was excited. He was about to conduct the most complex and fascinating experiment in the history of psychic research. The previous day, Garland had contacted his friend, novelist and musician Henry Fuller, a man who actually knew how to read music and play the piano, and he asked him to join him the next day at the seance. At 3 p.m, he and Henry Fuller met at the home of Mrs. Hartley, both of them ready to kick ass and write music with ghosts. The afternoon played out like a combination of Amadeus and the Changeling. For almost 3 hours in the middle of the day, Garland and Mrs. Hartley sat barely occupied, while Fuller collaborated with the ghostly McDowell, composing music. Here's how it worked. Fuller would hold the closed slates, sometimes in his hand, sometimes under his foot, and wait while the ghost of McDowell scribbled away with the slate pencil. Then he would open the slates, play the music that had been written there on an upright piano, and then make changes based on the notes given to him by McDowell's disembodied voice that hovered somewhere above him and to the left. Garland could hear the voice too, and would sometimes confer with Fuller about what they thought it said. Mrs. Hartley, the medium, sat on a couch across the room, apparently completely uninvolved in the process. If this sounds insane, then you're hearing it right. This is the most mind-blowing seance I've ever heard of. Just like in the movie Amadeus, Fuller took feverish dictation, like Salieri did for Mozart. McDowell's facility with composition far exceeded that of Fuller, and a real air of impatience is conveyed as Fuller adds a note here and the disembodied voice whispers, "Not there." And when Fuller corrects it, a sense of satisfaction is heard with a whispered, "Yes, there." Fuller asks a question into thin air. Shall I make this an eighth note? And the reply comes back, "Yes, if you please." Garland knows how crazy this all sounds. In the book, he repeatedly, and I mean repeatedly, describes how physically impossible it was for any of them to be creating the slate writing or producing the whispers through normal physical means. He and Fuller are constantly checking their perceptions against one another. Where are the slates? Where is the medium? Where are her hands? Constantly looking at her mouth and even the muscles in her neck when the ghostly voice speaks to see if ventriloquism is taking place. Again, all of this is happening in a bright sunlit room in the middle of the day, and it goes on for hours. Later, Garland and Fuller examine McDowell's existing compositions and find idiosyncratic musical quirks that matched the dictation they were given in the seance room. They spend hours comparing their individual notes, finding moments where Fuller and the dead composer appear to work cooperatively, and where they were at distinct opposition. Garland is like a hunter closing in on his prey, so close to having solid evidence of an independent but completely verified contact with a specific deceased human. All he needs to do is find the lost manuscript that matches what they received at Mrs. Hartley's house, and his life's work will be complete. Once the composition is done, Garland goes straight to McDowell's widow and his close friend, Marian McDowell, who up until this point is completely unaware that any of this has been going on. He tells her the whole story about the slates and the piano and the whispering voice of her dead husband, and as the coup de grace, he hands her the transcribed composition which her late husband has titled Ungari. And Marian laughs in his face. Not out of cruelty, but because the notion of this particular composition makes no sense to her. From the book, "There's nothing to it," she said. "There is no fragment called Ungari. There never was. I know every bar that Edward ever wrote. There never was such a composition. Your composer was fooling you. He was impersonating Edward." Garland is taken aback. But there is still a thin strand of hope. McDowell had implied that this missing composition might be in the hands of the music publisher Schubert and Company. This too makes no sense to Marian, since Edward only published through the A.P. Schmidt Company. Garland asks Marian to please check both publishing houses. "I will," she says, "but I know that I am right." She was. No missing composition of McDowell's, entitled Ungari, was found at either publishing house or among his personal papers. And to this day, if it indeed exists, it has never been located. Garland was stumped. He and Henry Fuller had spent hours conversing with a disembodied voice that sounded and seemed absolutely like his late friend Edward McDowell. The voice was able to reminisce about personal experiences the two men privately shared. It carried the force of McDowell's speech patterns, diction, and personality. And it wrote pages of music in the exact style of the late McDowell. But apparently, it wasn't him. So who or what was it? Garland never found out. Marian McDowell's complete lack of interest in what he had discovered and experienced seems to have knocked the wind out of him. For reasons even he has trouble coming to terms with decades later, he simply never followed up on any of it beyond that point. Over time and through various house moves, he even lost track of the ghostly composition itself. It simply didn't seem to matter. He says, quote, "Something in my mind, some barrier, could not be overcome. I wished to be convinced, but my desire was not strong enough to lead to further action." He then quotes Nathaniel Hawthorne, who came up against the same kind of emotional fatigue when faced with what they called supernormal evidence. In Nathaniel Hawthorne's words, quote, "What most astonishes me is the indifference with which I listen to the spiritualistic marvels. They are absolutely proved to be sober facts by evidence, and yet I cannot force my mind to interest myself in them. They are facts to my understanding, but they seem not to be facts to my intuition and deeper perceptions. My inner soul does not in the least admit them. There is a mistake somewhere." One night, about a week after I did the open mic night at the Improv, Michelle called. She sounded upset on the message she left, like she had been crying. So, of course, this time I called her back. It was the first time we had spoken in months. She told me that she had broken things off with Hatem. She didn't go into details. She just kept saying that he was not a good person. And I began to get the impression that something really bad had happened. Like maybe he'd hit her. So I asked her, "Did he hit you?" She wouldn't say. She just kept apologizing for what she'd done to me and promising me that she was definitely never going to be involved with him or anyone else on any level ever again, and that she hoped we could go back to the way things were. By the next morning, I knew I was taking her back. There really was never any question about that. There was never a moment where I said, hang on. You've been unhappy for the majority of the past 5 years. You're not supposed to be that unhappy in a relationship for that long. There is a mistake somewhere. My mistake was simply this. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to be unhappy. Hamlin Garland spent a lifetime pursuing one goal: proof of everlasting life for the human soul. The shadow of death, he wrote, toward the end of his life, once so remote, has become a cloud across my pathway, so close that I can almost touch it with my hand. The question of the survival of the soul has for me today a significance which it did not have when I began. I wish I could end this book with a triumphant song of victory, but I cannot do so. In the spring of 1936, at the age of 75, Garland is left to question if his lifelong efforts have all been worth it. But for me, in the spring of 1988, at the age of 21, such questions did not exist, for I knew that selling a script was hard and comedy was hard, but if I suffered enough pain and fear and refused to quit, one day it would all pay off. And so, the same must be true of my relationship with Michelle. It hurt like hell, but if I simply endured long enough and believed, one day I would find myself in heaven. Thank you for joining me on Richard Hatem's Paranormal Bookshelf. Richard Hatem's Paranormal Bookshelf is presented by Astonishing Legends, 134 West, and Summerland Entertainment. Executive producers, Scott Philbrook, Forrest Burgess, and Susan Lambert. Our associate producer is Tess Feifel, and our sound designer, engineer, and editor is Kevin Ducey. Artwork is by Tommy Beaver, website is by Kayla Lord, and our music, as always, is by Nima Kazaruni. Please join us next time as we hit the open road with the National Directory of Haunted Places. Until then, be safe and be well, find the light in the dark, and we'll see you again soon.